Okay, do my best to do a little bit of a recap, trying to keep in mind when I last saw you all. So since we last met, we've had the opportunity to showcase some of the products that are entering into or expanding their footprint in the Australian market with the Discover New events yesterday afternoon. Today, obviously, the Lowy Institute speech. I then have an investors' lunch. I had a debrief with the business delegation. I'll be meeting with the Premier of New South Wales a little later on today, and then the ANZLF dinner this evening before we finish up with bilateral engagements tomorrow. But happy now to take everyone's questions.
On Australian soil, you've spoken about the risks in isolating China. Is that you urging Australia to be more diplomatic with China?
No, not at all. This is not directed at anyone in particular, but simply New Zealand's position more broadly. And in fact, I echoed a very similar sentiment in Madrid at the NATO meeting, this view from New Zealand that actually diplomacy, dialogue, incredibly important from our perspective whenever we see tension, escalation, or issues that may impact on our peace and our stability.
And what did you mean by self-fulfilling prophecy in your speech? What are you saying there?
You know, one of our concerns is that if we treat some of the geostrategic issues that we have in our region in an overly simplistic way, then we lose the opportunity to engage and we risk further isolating some of those individuals that may be involved in some of that escalation. And so for us, it's about making sure that we don't make assumptions, make sure that we continue that dialogue, that diplomacy. New Zealand, as always, seeks stability in our region. In our view, the best way to achieve that is by keeping open that dialogue, even when we disagree.
You said earlier that China has a role to play in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What is that role?
Yeah, we have taken a very clear view that in the same way that we've called on members of the Security Council and others within the United Nations to take a very clear view on the illegal war in Ukraine and the challenge to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, that we seek everyone to take a firm position on that. And particularly, obviously, China as a member of the Security Council, we've urged them in the same way we have others. We've done that at officials level for some time. We've also done that at ministerial level. So that's been a consistent position that New Zealand's had. You will have seen some who have referenced the relationship that exists between China and Russia. You've also, however, seen China articulate their concern over the challenge to territorial integrity and reference the UN Charter as the flaw to their relationship. So we've sought to highlight that. If that is China's position, then it's our view that, of course, they should too join with the international community in calling out Russia on its war in Ukraine.
You've said the New Zealand government's done everything it can to support Ukraine at this time.
Yes.
Is China playing its role?
As I've said, our view is that the Security Council in particular should be a forum in which we see that response, the ability therefore for that institution to take action and impose sanctions. So we of course believe that there's more that can be done, and we'll continue to voice that concern. Obviously individual nations will take their own position. There are some who have taken either no position at all or in favour of Russia. Regardless, we will raise consistently with anyone our particular position on Ukraine, as do other members of the international community.
Are you up to date with Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong's comments in Singapore that China, she aligned Australia's position with Singapore's Prime Minister that China should show restraint when it comes to diplomatic relations, that China wields power with Russia and that it should do everything it can to calm that conflict down. What do you make of Penny Wong's comments?
Yeah, again, I just reflect on the position that we've taken, from the beginning of this war. You were rightly asking me what role were we playing in seeking to ensure that others who had significant power were taking strong positions on a war that ultimately disrupts a rules-based order. And we've consistently taken that position that we do have a role to play in reaching out, and we've done that, as I've said, at an official level, at a ministerial level, and we'll continue to do so. Ours is not necessarily based solely on the idea, though, of those who are most powerful hold singularly just only the responsibility. We all do. But they do have particular influence, including via Security Council membership. That means that we have addressed that concern directly to them.
Could China be doing more, though?
Oh, I think we've obviously raised the concern that we believe that as a member of the Security Council, as you've heard me articulate, as a nation that has benefited from the rules-based order, that there is a responsibility there. Obviously, they'll make their own decisions, but it hasn't stopped New Zealand sharing its view.
Prime Minister,
you
said in your speech that the war in Russia shouldn't be considered democracy versus autocracy, the West versus Russia, but kind of as a matter of fact, it's sort of both of those things. So what are you driving at when you make those comments?
The point that equally we should not remove the role nor the responsibility that other nations can play in placing pressure through their position on the war on Russia. And so I think if we immediately say this is just about the West versus Russia, we immediately exclude the role that others can and should play.
Do you think it is like democracy versus autocracy? Do you think that its global importance partially is at least that?
Yeah, no, I mean, here you would have instead heard me articulate that in fact, rather, this should be a conflict for which those who are deeply concerned about the disruption to the rules-based order, those who are deeply concerned by the humanitarian impacts of this war, by the threat to territorial integrity. There are a range of reasons why nations, regardless of their ideology, should be concerned and act on what they're seeing in Europe. And so here, we seek to engage that imperative from a range of countries, not just those who identify either regionally or with particular ideology.
Framing those comments in that way, though, you ended up giving a speech which looks very conciliatory to China. How much are you...
That's your interpretation.
How do you...
Would you care to...
To what extent do you see this as an opportunity to dampen things down a little bit?
Would you care to give some expansion of why you would see it in that way? Because in my mind, what I've expressed today is totally consistent with what I've said at NATO, with what I've said from the podium for some time now, and totally consistent with New Zealand's foreign policy position. When we see, a threat to New Zealand's values, when we see a threat to that rules-based order, we act, and we act decisively. On Ukraine, we've taken action that is expansive when you look across both the lethal and non-lethal aid and also in terms of our people on the ground. Is it conciliatory to call on others to take a strong position? I think actually it's just us acting with our own expectations that when we see a threat, regardless of your ideology, you should speak up. I don't consider that conciliatory. I consider that us taking a very strong values-based position.
Just a couple of questions from my colleagues in New Zealand. Why is there the reluctance to upgrade the government's 757 plane? And given the number of breakdowns we have to handle it, what message do you think that sends to other world leaders and other countries?
I don't think other world leaders particularly care about our 757s, to be honest.
Yeah, about professionalism and, that government...
Hey, so look here, I will speak very strongly in defence of our New Zealand Defence Force. Their primary job is not to transport me from time to time to the likes of Australia, should I be on a rare occasion visiting. Their job is to make sure that they're supporting New Zealand's interest, and particularly the interests of the Pacific region. And they do that with great success. We were amongst the first to respond in Tonga to the volcano. We've just recently arrived in Niue to respond to the pandemic. We transported vaccines, and if there are major weather events, we are there. Our 757s sit alongside our C-130s, our P3s and our soon-to-be P8s, alongside our Navy, and do an incredible job and do it well.
New COVID cases are over 10,000 in a day. What would you say to people who might think we need to tighten COVID restrictions? Is that something that's on the cards?
So it's not necessarily unexpected that as a result of B4 and B5 that we're seeing another wave. We are seeing this in other parts of the world. Now, that's not for a moment to be dismissive or to trivialise the impact on our health system. And that's why I'll continue that call. Please, everyone does have a role to play, but we have restrictions and guidelines in place that much of the rest of the world does not. They're not using masks like we continue to, and they're not using isolation requirements in the way that we do. We know from our modelling that that has the greatest impact, and that's why it remains fundamental. An increase in restrictions for red, for instance, that's gathering limits. I've not had advice at this stage that that would make a marked difference to the impact on, for instance, our hospitalisations at this stage. But isolation and mask use does, as does boosters. So please, if you're eligible, go out, make sure you get that booster shot.
You're meeting with the New South Wales Premier later today.
Yeah.
You're going to be discussing Kiwis in the flood zone, kind of how things are going for you.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it's a chance to catch up with what's happening in real time here. We have 150,000 New Zealanders in New South Wales, so of course I'll be interested to just engage and also pass on, you know, New Zealand's support for the state as it goes through this really tough period. And we've seen such extreme weather events in Australia. Again, it highlights for us why we should be continuing to work together on things that contribute, such as climate change.
You'll see your friend
Here, and then I'll finish up here.
The head of the FBI says China is the biggest long-term threat to economic and long-term security, and says their lavishly resourced hacking programs are cheating and stealing on a massive scale. Do you agree with that?
Hey, look, you'll see within New Zealand's national security priorities very distinct reference to cybersecurity because New Zealand is not immune to experiencing these challenges. Equally, you'll see climate change, foreign interference, a range of national security priorities, all of which are transparent and publicly available, and New Zealand's been really consistent around.
You'll see your friend Anthony Albanese
Yeah.
at the ANZLF tonight. Are you looking forward to seeing him, and how are you feeling going into the Bilat tomorrow?
Yeah, look, for me, the bilateral engagement tomorrow is an extension of, you know, that first conversation we had, but the difference will be we have with us our ministerial team able to jump into a bit more detail on specific subject areas and to make a little more progress. It won't necessarily bring issues to conclusion. It's still very early days for the new government here, but a very good opportunity. I'll also be looking to hear the Prime Minister's reflection on his recent visit to Kiev, just an insight into what he's seen on the ground and what role he believes New Zealand and Australia can play in their reconstruction.
What do you make of the situation in the UK with Boris Johnson, and how does that instability there affect New Zealand?
I just want to make it clear, it is in no way related to my recent visit, and nor was my visit 4 weeks prior to Theresa May's departure in any way connected as well. These ultimately are domestic political issues. Of course, New Zealand will be very mindful of any long-term ramifications, but I'm confident that actually the support, for instance, for our free trade agreement in the UK is broad-based. So regardless of what may happen in the future, I don't expect that to affect New Zealand's interests.
What does it sort of show about democracy in the way that it's working and some of the challenges?
Yeah, I'm careful to draw too many parallels. You know, I think, you know, one thing, for instance, in New Zealand we have a different system in the form of MMP. That in itself gives a different dynamic, I think, to domestic politics for us. So I'm always a bit wary about drawing too quickly on parallels between our two democracies.
Do you have any plans to visit Ukraine yourself?
As I've said on this occasion, when I received the invitation, it wasn't something I could fulfil. I have no immediate plans, but certainly the President left the invitation open, and likewise the invitation for him to, at a time and a place when it's possible for him, when there is, you know, resolution and reprieve, he knows he is always welcome to visit New Zealand, and I can tell you he expressed a deep desire to do so. Yeah, I'll finish with you, Richard.
Relative to your comments on the Pacific, and given the labour force problems that we've got in New Zealand at the moment, is there a case for increasing the number of RSE workers?
You know, I think here there's always been a sense, of course, that the RSE scheme is yes, about how we can work together where there's obvious employment opportunities in New Zealand, but equally it's also designed to fulfil the needs of the Pacific. Now, as you heard Prime Minister Fiame mention when she came to New Zealand recently, she noted that the original design of the RSE scheme was meant to, for instance, address unemployment issues within the source country, and that in her mind perhaps greater work needed to be done to make sure that that was indeed the way that the scheme was operating. So it's not just for us to say let's scale up because that's in the Pacific interest. We do need to make sure that that is where the Pacific wishes to see this program go as well. Thank you, everyone.